It's an enormous privilege, actually, to be the warm-up act for such a stellar cast of guest speakers. So I'm looking forward very much to the day. And I think this is a topic which everybody in the room obviously is interested in. But it's worth reminding ourselves, perhaps, that this is the decade in which we tipped over into half the world's population being urban. And that of all the people on the earth today, 1 in 100 live in the British Isles. So urban is the only show in town, in a sense, and this is a country that really needs to find ways of addressing the need to accommodate nature within urban environments. And our urban environments are becoming more and more hostile, more and more stressful, and I think through the day you'll see that actually nature, green space, is something of an antidote to the kinds of problems that we face. There's nothing new in that, though. There's a very, very long history of recognition that it helps with urban living if you can escape into the shade of trees, the sound of birdsong. That kind of relationship goes back, way back, centuries, millennia, I guess. But it's still very clearly evident today. You only have to walk into a garden centre to see that the commitment of the great British nation to spending its money on trying to attract more nature close to where we live and work is alive and well. And that relationship is very deep-rooted, I think, and many of us kind of just feel it in our bones. But I think what's been exciting in the last 10, 20 years is the sound science that has really backed up that gut feeling that we need nature in our lives, and particularly the kinds of lives that most of us now lead in the kinds of places where we have to live. In this country, I suppose, there was a kind of major kickstart to that whole idea of the value of green space in towns and cities that ran in parallel with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, huge population shift into towns and cities, some altruism, urban parks seen as a way of improving the quality of life, but a great deal of just straightforward business common sense. If you're driving people for 6.5 days of the week in grim factories, then actually somewhere where they can breathe and exercise is probably not a bad investment. And there were two people in particular, I think, that it's worth quoting. J.C. Loudon, regarded as the godfather of landscape architecture in this country, who was talking about the need for breathing spaces at the beginning of the 19th century. And then John Ruskin, following on from that, their lives overlapped by about 20 years, really talking about the desperate need for urban human beings to have access to the arts and nature if their life was going to be tolerable. Those two people, I think, between them really set the standard, set the conversation running for the need to find ways of mixing industrial, economic success, high-density urban living with access to, in John Ruskin's case, the arts as well as nature. In my own particular case, and everybody has their own personal story, I spent my 20s, I suppose, working in some of the grimmest places in Britain, in Brixton and Toxteth and Deptford and all kinds of pretty dreadful inner-city places. And there was a period in my career in the very late 70s, early 80s, at the time when the Urban Wildlife Group was starting, when almost everywhere I worked there were riots. Difficult to correlate the two, but nevertheless, I was working in the kinds of places where there was serious civil unrest. This is the Brixton riots. I was working on the Tulse Hill estate, actually at that time regarded as the worst estate under the GLC's bailiwick. It was so bad there that actually on a Friday night, the truck drivers who dealt with waste in the city didn't bother going to the tip. They actually drove onto the Tulse Hill estate and emptied their lorries on the housing estate. And the particular site that I was working on had that kind of abuse in its history for as long as anybody could remember. And the reason this was a Damascene moment for me was at the end of the Brixton riots, when everything was trashed, the whole place was burned out, nobody had touched the sunflowers on the Tulse Hill Nature Garden because the kids had planted them, the community had seen them grow up, and there was a clear sense of really powerful commitment to that little glimmer of nature in the heart of an extremely hostile urban environment. So that was the moment, I suppose, when I really began to see that whatever the conservation movement was saying about there being no nature in towns and cities, and that the urbanists amongst us were just lowering the general standards by talking about wildlife in towns. Actually, what really mattered was that there were huge numbers of people living in towns who would never really have access to the kinds of nature reserves and wild landscapes that some of the rest of us were lucky enough to be able to access if we had the time and the transport. So that relationship right at the heart of the inner city was very central to where I'm coming from now. And all over the world, there's been a really strong sense that actually nature in the city has a powerful role to play, that it isn't a kind of an optional add-on, it has to be central. These are just a few spectacular examples, actually. On the right, Denver has a 25 square mile area of wilderness in the city boundary called the Arsenal, only there because it was so polluted by chemical warfare manufacturing in the Second World War that nobody's been allowed in since. 25 square miles is a significant wild space in the city. Cape Town has a huge wetland that takes all of the stormwater runoff from the city and is a major educational resource within that city. Singapore uses its green space to harvest rainwater and to cleanse it on a small island with a large population. That's pretty significant. And a lot of you will be familiar with the more recent example in New York of the High Line, abandoned railway line, converted into a green space, a greenway. And perhaps the most spectacular example of all is in Seoul in South Korea, where the mayor, and I use that word advisedly in Bristol, the mayor made the extraordinary decision to sweep away a 10-kilometre stretch of 8-lane highway in order to liberate the river, the Changchung River beneath, to create a green corridor right through the city, partly as a flood management system, but most importantly as a green space that would allow people to travel through that very urban city with kingfishers and herons and trickling water. And these aren't artists' impressions, this is the real place. So all over the world there are examples of nature being either tolerated or accommodated, depending on its history, within major cities. And one of the reasons I think that that's really taken hold in recent years is because of this sound science that backs up the gut feeling that it must be good for us. We know now, because of the work of people like Roger Ulrich in the States and various other key players, that actually you can measure the reduction in stress levels for people if they have immediate access to nature. And the extraordinary thing is that you can measure it within 3 to 4 minutes of taking people out of a stressful situation, putting them into green space. You can measure the reduction in the tension in the forehead muscles, for instance. The pulse rate slows. Now, 3 to 4 minutes means that actually this is an issue which is not about parks, it's not about nature reserves on the edge of the city, it's not about a day out in a national park. This is about having a school grounds that actually has trees and greenery in it, having a courtyard in the office that isn't just for smokers, but is actually for people who want fresh air. That kind of very immediate relationship is absolutely central. And I think in particular, I feel that it, and I would say this now, absolutely fundamental given the demographics and given the social attitude to access. With an aging population, this is my mum, she's now 96. If she doesn't have access to birdsong outside her kitchen window, she doesn't have access to birdsong. If you're a child in our society, then the kind of feral childhood that I had, of kind of escaping home at 8 in the morning and coming back at 5 in the afternoon covered in mud, simply isn't allowed, isn't tolerated. And so both those ends of the social demographic spectrum are absolutely dependent on having nature very close to home, absolutely on the doorstep. But it applies to all of you too. The kind of stressful lives that we lead means that if we can actually just get out into green space for 10 minutes between meetings or have our sandwiches under a tree somewhere, it just makes a difference to our whole life. our whole quality of life. And I certainly know that for me, second only to gin and tonic on the Friday night, 5 minutes in the back garden, and I feel the stresses of the week lifting from my shoulders. So that immediacy, I think, is a really key part of what we've learned about and that we now need to try and deliver in cities like this and every other city in the world. I said it was particularly important for children. This is a very old slide of mine now, but and I always say, obviously this is a child that's been told never to take both feet off the tarmac, whatever happens, but desperately trying to find daisies to make a daisy chain. And back in 1982, at the very beginning of the urban wildlife movement, in Birmingham we organised something called the International Daisy Chain Championships, which was one of those great self-fulfilling prophecies that that's shaped my life, really. The Urban Wildlife Group leaked the story to the Birmingham Post and Mail that Birmingham had been selected as the location for the International Daisy Chain Championships. And then the City Council was contacted with this newspaper cutting to say, do you realise we've been selected? We now need a big area of daisies in one of your parks in order to hold this great event. And we suggested that the area of goose-trampled ground by one of the lakes in one of the main parks in Cannon Hill would be a perfect place. In Canada, daisies are known as gooseweed because they're about the only plant that survives Canada geese. Sure enough, the local authority, the Parks Department, put a fence around a big square, of course it would be a square, and up came the daisies. And surprise, surprise, a Birmingham school won the International Daisy Chain Championships. The mayor was photographed with daisies around his neck. But most significantly, within about 2 months, the Parks Department had a member of staff seconded from the Urban Wildlife Group to work with them on ways of actually renaturing their urban parks. So there was a revolution going on, really, and it was important in that it wasn't just saying, this is dreadful, we need to change it. It was two things that were critical, I think. There was a recognition that we needed to work with other major players rather than just against them. And the other thing that was very significant and was a real unintended consequence of the Thatcher government was that the Urban Wildlife Group, for instance, went from nowhere to 60 staff in about 3 months because the unemployment levels were very high. There was a job creation scheme, the Manpower Services Commission of the day, and that actually led to the professionalisation of the whole environmental movement. If you talk to anybody in their 50s, in the RSPB, the National Trust, the Wildlife Trust, right across the board, so many of those people graduated in the end of the 70s, early 80s, and got their first job through a Manpower Services Commission sponsored post, which was in work that nobody had ever done before. The idea that you could be employed to encourage daisies to grow in the local park was not really on anybody's agenda, but was suddenly made feasible. And that's been kind of followed through in that the Heritage Lottery Fund, for instance, has now spent something like £5 billion on the rehabilitation of urban parks. Now, it's not all been spent on bringing nature into parks, far from it. But it's been a clear recognition that actually, if you want to get the lottery money back to the people who buy the lottery tickets, urban green space is a very, very good place to spend the money. And there is just today or this week a new initiative being launched by the Wildlife Trust called Every Child Wild, which is just the latest chapter in that whole programme of wanting to connect people with nature. There have been some celebrity sites in the process. This is Kam Li Street in King's Cross. Was a lorry park 30 years ago. I was very involved in the planning of all of this, and so was David Good, who's here. The miracle is that it's still there. Despite massive urban renewal around King's Cross, that place, with its pond-dipping platform and its huge local following, is still there. People like the Prime Minister, if there are people like the Prime Minister, go there to be photographed amongst nature. And just last week, when I was looking for photos of Kam Li Street, I discovered that this man had turned up on his bike to launch his environmental strategy. So, at one level, the politicians really value nature in the cities, even if it's only for photo calls. The challenge for all of us is to get that translated into policies and expenditure that actually delivers a sustainable conservation of those resources. One of the things that very quickly emerged in the 80s and has been a mainstay of urban nature conservation ever since is the need to actually link sites together, and a recognition that there was a linearity to much of the wild space. This is the Black Country. The canals, the railway lines provide a fantastic network of resources that can be combined with the need for access, the need for healthy exercise. So the Walking the Way to Health program has really capitalized on the need to make sure you can travel through a town or a city without crossing the roads. The canal network is fantastic for providing completely traffic-free pedestrian routes. But it's also that kind of wild network, quite different from the formal parks, has a cultural role to play too. It's not just good for the butterflies and the blackberries, it's good for blackberry jam. That kind of relationship between the very local landscape and nature is very rich, and it's very deep-rooted, and it does engage with health and well-being in lots of different ways, and diet and exercise are clearly high on the agenda now. And nature plays that kind of role in lots of subtly different ways too. We tend to look at the problem of scavenging wildlife in towns and cities as a problem, or many people do. In reality, without the foxes and the pigeons, and dare I say it, the rats and a few other things, we would be up to the bedroom windows in garbage by now. So the wildlife of the city is playing a very functional role, and that's something that you'll hear a great deal about later in the day. The whole, what's now termed ecosystem services, tends to be rather more spectacular examples than this. But if you just think about the sewage treatment works for a moment, that trickling water running down through the filter beds is being cleansed not by some magic chemical, but actually by a microscopic community of a whole range of plants and animals that basically graze on the algae that grow on the stones and cleanse and remove the pollutants. So at that level too, nature in the city is absolutely fundamental. There are more obvious candidates for high-profile nature in the city than the tiny little snails that graze on the algae in the sewage works. You know, the conservation organisation for them is struggling to get members, I guess. Whereas the Harry Potter world, of course, aspires to having owls in every neighbourhood. And the important thing here, I think, is that if we're going to sustain the extraordinary diversity of wildlife that we have in towns and cities, then we have to have a much more joined-up approach to the strategic management of towns and cities. I have tawny owls in my neighbourhood in Wolverhampton because I have big trees with holes in them. Big trees in holes with them are seen as a serious health and safety hazard. And when they grow alongside the road, they're seen as a traffic hazard too. And the control of roadside trees is in the hands of highway engineers who may have read Harry Potter but haven't made the connection to dead trees and hollow branches. And we've seen over and over again that single-minded policies, I was very involved in this city and elsewhere in trying to get some sense into the underground cabling industry that was chopping through the roots of every street tree in the country without realizing that those were the only roots for these big trees. And there was an impossibility about getting the communications industry or the relevant ministry to take the idea of tunnelling under these trees more seriously. And just as another example, I'm very conscious, particularly working in London as I do, that the London plains are almost entirely dependent for their survival on leaking water mains. If you relentlessly go through the city solving the water leakage problem, you will kill the trees. They're particularly vulnerable to a disease called Masaria, which actually is triggered by drought. So the idea that we can sustain our green cities and our nature in cities through an unholy alliance of these big players from different departments is the real challenge. Not knowing more about tawny owl nesting habits, but actually knowing more about cable trenching and water leakage and highway engineers' mindsets is, I think, the key to the future for all of us. And I'm just going to finish with an example of a spectacular kind of role for nature in cities, which gets a lot of headlines. This is the Thames in flood. And One of the things that is beginning to emerge now is the recognition that you can't solve these big environmental problems with a single hit. There is no silver bullet. You need a whole range of different solutions. So in the case of flood defence, we need to soften up the front gardens, which at the moment are being paved over, to reduce the rainwater runoff that backs up and creates some of the flooding problem. We need to accommodate natural soft areas in sustainable urban drainage schemes, and these can deliver those linear wetlands that can bring back dragonflies and frogs and maybe even kingfishers in some places right to the heart of the city as a part of stormwater management, not as a part of nature conservation. Green roofs and green walls are beginning to emerge. In East London, there's a policy for large buildings to have green roofs, and you'll hear again more about that kind of architectural end of the spectrum of delivering greener cities later on. And I couldn't resist putting this in. I'm not sure this is really a part of the solution, but as a part of the raising of profiles, the idea of green roofs on buses seems to me to be worth pursuing. This is in Spain, as it happens. In London, actually, there's another issue or another approach, which is the grand projet, the super sewer, which some of you would know about, which is actually basically the high engineering way of dealing with stormwater management. A very large pipe under the bed of the River Thames to take the stormwater runoff and the sewage and direct to the sewage treatment works, with lots and lots of connections from the riverbanks, so that when the sewers overflow, they will no longer overflow straight into the river and kill the fish. Now, from a wildlife point of view, that's clearly going to increase fish fry survival. More interestingly, I think, the structures themselves are going to help fish fry migration from the salt water of the outer estuary of the Thames up to the freshwater, which they do by riding on the rising tide. They have to get to the freshwater as part of their life cycle, many of them, things like sea bass and Dover sole. And what they need is places to hang out when the tide goes out again. And so these structures are being redesigned to accommodate the fish fry on their migration upriver. We're going to see the evidence of that with many more sightings of cormorants, for instance, in the heart of the city. And there is a growing population of harbour porpoises in the Thames estuary. Well, they're not there eating sandwiches and Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're catching fish. And the fish are in the Thames really in greater numbers than they've been for 200 years. And the Thames estuary isn't just an issue for the wildlife of that city. Finally, I think it's important to begin to think about the role our cities play internationally. The swifts that you have in this city and that I have in Wolverhampton, many of them will travel into the country from Africa up the Thames estuary. It's one of those points of entry. The first insects that they feed on in Britain will be over some of the outer wetlands of the Thames estuary. And I've been working internationally quite a lot just recently with an Alliance for Religions and Conservation. I'm always introduced as the person not of faith in this gathering, which is an interesting kind of epithet. I went 2 years ago to the ceremony in Jerusalem to welcome the swifts that nest in the Western Wall. And we had 4 religious leaders from different religions standing in front of the Western Wall for the first time in 1,000 years, just because the swifts were returning. That's powerful stuff. What's really powerful, though, is that there's also a swift colony in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Now, getting a conversation between people in Jerusalem and Bethlehem is a challenge, to say the least, but the swifts have managed to pull it off. And just across the border in Jordan, the Grand Mosque in Amman also has a swift colony. And if you start to think about that, and think about this week's events, there is a swift colony in and around the cathedral in Paris, where the ceremony was held earlier this year. There is a swift colony in St. Peter's, Rome. We have one in Canterbury Cathedral. There may even be swift colonies in this bit of Bristol. And my point really is that actually, if we think laterally enough about the role of nature in cities, we can go all the way from daisy chains on the lawn in the back garden for 4-year-olds, right through to, who knows, world peace. That would be nice. Thank you.